Rawls famously offered the method of reflective equilibrium, which you might use elsewhere, but he thinks is applicable in the case of ethics. I want to convince you that it's not. I think there's an excellent argument for rejecting it, which of course draws on my loose reconstruction of Greene's argument from earlier in this course. Let's look at the method of reflective equilibrium. Rawls gets me very excited. He's a bit of a tease. He says, one may think of our moral theory at first as the attempt to describe our moral capacity. And at this point I'm like, oh wow, you know, he's gonna be drawing on moral psychology. But not a bit of it, not a bit of it. Sadly for me, he's not interested in moral psychology at all. He goes on, what's required is a formulation of a set of principles which, when conjoined to our beliefs and knowledge of the circumstances, would lead us to make these judgments. Which judgments? The judgments that we are, on reflection, disposed to make, although they're not justified inferentially, with their supporting reasons, were we to apply these principles. So here's the idea. There's a bunch of judgments that, you know, you're for some reason or another inclined to make, although you perhaps can't initially justify them. You can work out a set of principles that are consistent with those and generalize from them, and then you've done your reflective equilibrium. All right, what could go wrong? What could go wrong with that? Well, here again is my reconstruction of Greene's argument, where I've stripped it down and tried to be sure that my conclusion is fairly modest, but my premises are very likely to be true. So the idea was to get rid of some of the things that might cause problems, to avoid some objections. Now, if we just take a look at the conclusion here, the conclusion is that premises which are not justified inferentially about particular moral scenarios cannot be used in ethical arguments where the aim is knowledge. So the important thing, of course, is that the conclusion here is restricted to premises about particular moral scenarios, whereas Rawls' method of reflective equilibrium should be understood, I take it, to include a wider range of judgments. But actually we can generalise our argument here. So it's only in step 5 that particular moral scenarios enter. The other steps, if you remember, don't mention specific moral scenarios at all. It's only step 5 that does. So what we've got to do is to work out how to generalise step 5. And if we can generalise step 5, we'll be able to generalise step 6 as well. So step 5 says that we've got reason to suspect that the moral scenarios philosophers consider are unfamiliar situations. And what we want to do here, if we're going to generalise from moral scenarios to moral principles, well, we want to show that the moral principles are going to concern unfamiliar situations as well. The key to this, the key to getting this generalization to work, is to recall that fast processes trade accuracy to gain speed. Why is that? General principle, widely established over 100 years in cognitive science, any broadly inferential process needs to make some kind of trade-off between speed and accuracy. In general, if you want to be more accurate, you're going to be slower, and conversely. That's also true in many cases of action as well, as a general rule. Now, given that trade-off between speed and accuracy, think about what could easily happen. So here you've got a curve and you've got a set of typically encountered situations. What you notice here is that in those typically encountered situations, it looks like a straight line. Now, it isn't exactly a straight line, but the thing about your fast process is that it's not about being 100% accurate. It's about speed. Well, one way to get fast results is to have fewer parameters in your model, right? So we might as well model this as a straight line. Now, as far as the fast process goes, it's now done its job. It's got a terrific model, very low error rate, that can be applied very quickly. Look what happens outside those typically encountered situations. Gosh, you know, there's a bit more wiggly stuff going on. The error rate's going to be very high outside your typically encountered scenarios. But the fast process doesn't care, right? That's not what the fast process is for. The fast process is through getting you through the day in the orderly environment that you live in. For walking around planet Earth, where most things are moving horizontally, where variations in gravity are relatively rare. If you're landing a rocket on the comet, your physical fast processes are not your friend. Same thing with the ethical ones, perhaps. So this is what's happening. We've got a speed accuracy trade-off, and it works out very well. The reason why you have slow as well as fast processes is precisely to allow you to deal with the situations that you don't typically encounter while potentially going a bit crazy, right? So your slow processes might allow you to deal with these kind of situations, but there's also a risk here that you could take these situations as somehow canonical and be radically wrong about the typically encountered situations. Why is it good to have two processes, a fast one and a slow one? Well, the fast one is robust in the typically encountered situations. That's going to robustly get you an answer with low error, no matter how much craziness you've been reading. So you've been reading Hegel or Spinoza or something like that. You've got a radically false picture of the world. It's messed up your slow process, but your fast process is still getting you through the day, fed, sheltered, and all the rest. Your slow process, on the other hand, of course it can go radically wrong, but it also gives you a chance of getting the strange, unfamiliar cases right as well. The combination of the two is allowing you to make complementary trade-offs between speed and accuracy, and that's a good thing for you. You can be slower and more accurate here, faster and less accurate here, where speed is the key. All right, why does this matter? Well, if you recall, we don't know which situations are unfamiliar because unfamiliar is described as a situation where your experience or your culture or your evolutionary history doesn't equip you to deal with it doesn't equip your fast process to deal with that situation. Because in the case of ethics, we know remarkably little about the principles governing the fast process. We can't actually infer in a principled way what's going to be a familiar situation, what's going to be an unfamiliar situation. That's very difficult to do. But there are nevertheless good rules that we can use to avoid using fast processes in unfamiliar situations. Some of that comes from Hogarth's research on what he calls wicked learning environments. And the general rule of thumb here is that we've got to meet two criteria to rely on the fast processes. First of all, your experience should be representative of the situation that your judgment applies to, and it should also allow you to have valid feedback. Now, earlier we thought about this in terms of moral scenarios. Suppose we think about it now more generally. So we think about judgments which are not about particular cases, but generalizations. Well, here's the thing. If it's a generalization, how representative is your experience going to be of all of the cases where that generalization applies? It looks like there's a risk. That's what the charts were kind of indicating, that the feedback that you have will be representative overwhelmingly of typical situations, but your judgment will apply in untypical situations. And it's worse than that, because actually the reason why you want, as a philosopher, to rely on a not justified inferentially judgment about generalized cases is precisely to go beyond the cases where your intuitions work. So I think here we face actually a dilemma. If your not justified inferentially judgments concern only familiar situations, then they're kind of redundant because we have the fast processes for that anyway. There's nothing really to be gained by generalizing over the case-by-case basis, or very little, right? There's no radical new ethical insight to be had. On the other hand, if your not justified inferentially judgments do concern unfamiliar situations, well, now you're potentially informative, but we've got good reason to reject it. So there is a real challenge. How can we meet these two criteria? Your not justified inferentially judgment about general cases is based on representative feedback, representative experience and valid feedback, and also what you're offering us is something informative. I think the dilemma is right here. We can't do that. The principle is either uninteresting because we already have the fast processes for it, or else it's telling us about unfamiliar situations, and we shouldn't then, in that case, accept it. So that's why I think we can generalize the conclusion of the loose reconstruction of Greene's argument. It's not just about particular moral scenarios. We should also not accept not justified inferentially principles concerning debatable principles, any debatable principles. So doctrine of double effect, for example, would count as a debatable principle. The idea that your duty not to harm ranks above your duty to help, that's a debatable principle. People can take different views on that. The idea that distance is or isn't morally relevant, that's a debatable principle that people can take different sides on. So none of those things here should be accepted or rejected on the basis of not justified inferentially premises. So the conclusion of our argument. And so far I think that there's quite a bit to be said for this argument. But where does that leave us with respect to Rawls' method of reflective equilibrium? How does that apply here? Well, here the thought is this. We accept that these judgments may contain particular cases, or they may contain general principles. In either way, insofar as these are not justified inferentially judgments, they're not things that we should be relying on in this case. They're not things that we should be relying on in this case. On the other hand, suppose that we just have a set of judgments about particular scenarios and principles which concern only familiar situations, right? And they come from the fast processes. Now we're absolutely super. We're in a really good position to rely on those judgments and principles because they concern only the familiar scenarios. But look what happens with reflective equilibrium. We then formulate a set of principles, so presumably there's some element of generalization, otherwise we haven't made any progress at all. Right? So we're trying to generalize those to new cases, but that's exactly what you shouldn't be doing. In principle, it's wrong to generalize from cases that are familiar to cases that are unfamiliar. The fast processes work super well for the familiar cases. They may happen to work well in the unfamiliar cases, as in the case we saw with physical cognition. They work well for cartoons, which are presumably unfamiliar cases. But that's an accident, or if it's not an accident, it's based on the fact that the fast processes have been, to some extent, reverse engineered by graphic designers. So we're left with this dilemma. If we include not justified inferentially judgments in the base for reflective equilibrium that we then go to try generalize with the principles, or principles with implications for unfamiliar situations, then we've got a starting point where we're not justified in accepting. In fact, I think we've got good reason to reject those principles. We may have high subjective confidence in them. It may seem to us that these are truths, just as it may seem to you that a projectile exiting a spiral tube may continue on a spiral trajectory. That can seem a very compelling idea, but you are not justified in accepting that, and indeed there's a good reason why you shouldn't accept that. The impression is based on a fast process, and fast processes will not be correct in these unfamiliar situations except by some kind of accident. The alternative, of course, is that we could include not only not justified inferentially judgments about familiar situations, but in that case, reflective equilibrium shouldn't give us any new results. It shouldn't give us any new results because we are not justified from generalizing from them. So the concern here, this is very crude, I don't think this is the full extent of the argument, but the concern in effect is, either we're taking points from outside of the typically encountered situations, and then we're taking our data points as on the straight line, which is giving us a large margin of error to start with, or alternatively our data points are coming in from only the typically encountered situations, so then we've got a low margin of error to start with, and we're justified in accepting the starting data points, but we're not justified in generalizing beyond the typically encountered situations. Either way, the method of reflective equilibrium, as Rawls characterizes it, is not a good method for us to use. This is not a good method for us to use, I should say, if our concern is to arrive at knowledge. Here's the catch. Reflective equilibrium might be a great method to use if we want to do something psychological. So if we want to, for example, characterize the way that these fast processes work, try to work out some of the structure underpinning them. It might also be interesting in its own right. What does the world look like according to fast processes? If we relied only on those in all cases, what kind of ethical world would we be living in? That's a very interesting question to answer. The one thing we can't do is use reflective equilibrium if our goal is to arrive at knowledge concerning ethical principles. That would clearly be a mistake.